I'm just going to introduce the Prime Minister. That can be done fairly quickly. We've had fantastic days, but to get some as authoritative statement as you can get on where Sweden is, we got the Prime Minister here. Introduction, we know each other since a long time. When I was Prime Minister, it was late Bronze Age, one of the crises I had to deal with was a crisis in our youth organization. Because we had two guys who were competing for power. And it was an intense power struggle that went into the legends of Swedish history. And I have to say, Ulf, I can't remember who won that particular one. But the important thing is that both of them went on to become prime ministers. One of them was Fredrik Reinfeldt, who was prime minister for 8 years. And the other one was Ulf Kristersson, who is Prime Minister at the moment. So fighting in youth organizations, there's something to it, evidently. Then Ulf has had a distinguished career, dealing quite a lot, and that's unusual, with social affairs. With both social affairs in the city of Stockholm, which is a complicated place, very complicated place, and then Minister of Social Affairs in another complicated government. But he has another thing, which is slightly unique, for being a prime minister. He's also been living in China. So while a lot of people talk about China, I would suspect he will do that, as a matter of fact. He actually knows more about the place than most others. With that, Ulf, just over to you.
Well, thanks, Carl. Thanks for that kind introduction, and honestly, thanks for your last trip to Ankara, and thanks again for again and again making important missions for your country. We are many of us in this country that appreciate that flexible attitude of yours and your willingness to fly all over the world. And believe me, it is an honor for me to join you here today. I've closely followed your work recently, or also the last years. Impressive, I have to say. And again, welcome to Stockholm. Let me start today, and perhaps also end today with China, actually. Because the challenges we face right now might be the greatest of modern times. I realize it's too easy to overstate the importance of the dynamics that you experience yourself. That goes for all of us. And perhaps that's how it is for every generation. But without agreeing on the reasons why, these are really, quote, changes not seen in 100 years, as Xi Jinping recently said as he concluded his trip to Moscow. China has obviously changed enormously since the late 70s in almost every respect. Millions and millions of people have, as we know, brought out of poverty. The scientific and the technological success are self-evident. Chinese companies conquer the world, and the West has finally, I believe, understood that this part of the world deserves actually our curiosity and attention. That is basically good. But the West and other free market democracies did not realize, I think, the full consequence of facing the world's first economically successful authoritarian non-democracy of modern times. That is a dramatic change in how we perceive the world. For too long, we thought that being democratic was the only path to material success. We were obviously wrong. Now China is increasingly repressive at home and assertive abroad. That is also something new. The soft power of the free world back in the 1990s was pretty unchallenged. Today, the need for the world's democracies to deliver, to be competitive and to stay attractive will be vital for our role in future geopolitics. Today, I'd like to speak about foreign policy steps we are taking in Sweden, formulating policies in our coming role as an ally, but also about what we are doing in our EU presidencies last weeks to help Europe stay united and competitive and in an even closer transatlantic partnership. This has proved to be crucial in regards to the free world's support to Ukraine, but it's equally true regarding our and Europe's relations to China. Transatlantic unity is key and is fundamental value in itself. I'm not against strategy, nor am I against autonomy. But I do believe the US, the last year, has proved its deep commitment to the European continent. We should match this commitment with an engagement in, for example, the Indo-Pacific. Today, the defining focus for my government since taking off some 8 months ago has been to display our support to our Ukrainian friends in need. We decided to get rid of an almost bizarre legacy of not being able to support the country with military equipment when they need weapons the most. Instead, we have gathered an almost unanimous parliament to back 11 military support packages so far. Infantry fighting vehicles, tanks, advanced air defense systems, training, and at the request of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, their pilots are now about to conduct evaluation flights on the Gripen fighters. The Russian full-scale aggression led Sweden to a groundbreaking shift in our own security policy doctrine. As we hope to soon complete our NATO accession, we will pass a milestone in our 200 years long journey from neutrality to solidarity. It is indeed a question of a pragmatic realism, and I truly respect those who could change their mind on NATO when it was simply necessary. But it is also a question of values. So I do also honor the brave Swedes who did promote NATO membership at a time when they got nothing but mockery in response. As a NATO ally, Sweden will not only seek common protection, but also be a security provider with a 360-degree approach. We have a few assets, and I'm not too shy to emphasize them: our geography, on land and in the archipelago. We will be the missing link connecting allies in the East with the Atlantic. We are strong in the air and under the surface of the Baltic Sea, and we know, not least through exceptional radar capacity, an awful lot about Russia. Our capabilities will make the alliance stronger. That is our firm conviction. We meet here today during the very final weeks of the EU presidency, and allow me to say what you perhaps could guess. It's been extremely time-consuming and very meaningful, and also, honestly, great fun. We have tried to summarize our efforts in 3 key words. We promote Europe to be greener, safer, and freer. Greener, safer, and freer. The number 1 priority is, of course, a broad and united support to Ukraine. That was not an obvious consequence of the full-scale invasion. United militarily, but also politically. I stick to the important wording merit-based, but we do believe that Ukraine's future is within the EU. Another important ambition has been to address Europe's long-term challenges in terms of competitiveness and economic growth. Because the EU clearly lags behind, the US West Coast and the Chinese East Coast have become the world's 2 innovation and technology hotbeds. Good for them, but not necessarily good for us. So with our presidency, we have successfully put European growth and competitiveness back on the European agenda. I think the EU has proved its abilities in crisis management over the years. That is necessary, but that is not sufficient. Let's also bring on the long term again to the European agenda. And we've had the big responsibility of leading the final negotiations on the climate package Fit for 55. I do hope to be able to close it in a week or so. There is always something being complicated by the end, as you know. In all these aspects of cooperation, from defense to trade to climate, transatlantic cooperation is and should be a cornerstone for the EU. And we really did underline that last week when we hosted the EU-US Trade and Technology Council in Luleå, in the northern parts of Sweden. Finding common standards and solutions on AI, 6G, and clean tech will benefit both sides of the Atlantic. Finally, the second round of discussions on China at the European Council at the end of June will be an important one. And I think there is a momentum and perhaps a beginning convergence in different EU countries' views on China. Let me just say just a few words. Carl suggested them about my personal relationship with China. I myself lived in Beijing with my family 2008 and 2009. And since I'm a very typical Swede, my own task was mainly to take care of our 3 kids, while my wife worked with major Swedish industrial companies. Hence, I've engaged with extremely rich and dynamic Chinese culture. I have had food from all over China, traveled across China. I met wonderful and energetic people, been in the impressive skyscrapers of Shanghai, the poor countryside on my way to Tibet, and met with the tech startups of Hong Kong. I like this. A few years ago, I also tried to prove my very limited, but at that time still existing knowledge in Chinese. My kids were not impressed. Come on, Daddy, what a lousy pronunciation. Before and after living there, I visited China many times from 1997 over the millennium until 2010. At that time, many of us thought that economic integration and new technologies would put China on a path to more freedom. Instead, I would say, technology has cemented China's governance model. The internet was obviously powerful at that time, but so was and is the Great Firewall. AI will be powerful, but so will the Chinese control be. I was obviously not the only person being pretty enthusiastic in the early 2000s. I remember reading a fascinating book called What Does China Think? In 2008, if I remember correctly, written by someone named Mark Leonard, whom I had not at the time yet met. Being in Beijing at the same time, I saw on a daily basis exactly what Mark described in the book. That hope was alive for a while, and even in early 2013, quite a few expected liberalization to continue. They and we were simply wrong. How China chooses to face its economic, geopolitical, and demographic challenge in the coming years will, of course, shape China's future. But the consequences of China's development will also have a defining importance for other parts of the world. China has, since 2001, been an integrated, an increasingly integrated part of the global economy, and even more an indispensable part of the solution in fields like fighting climate change, improving biodiversity and global health, dealing with disarmament and conflict resolution, and quite a few other important issues of mutual concern. But our relationship with China needs to be a two-way street. We expect China to engage on substance and deliver on its commitments. The idea of decoupling would simply not be in our own interests. But as Ursula von der Leyen has rightly stated, de-risking is not decoupling, nor does it mean disengagement. However, de-risking does mean ensuring that our exchanges with China are consistent with our own interests, values, and national security concerns. We will continue to address human rights violations, including in Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong. The same goes for the consular case of Swedish citizen Gui Minhai, which remains a priority for my government and for the entire EU. We call for his immediate release. In terms of trade, Sweden, exactly as we argue within the EU, welcomes competition, and we are believers in competitiveness. But we also demand level playing fields vis-à-vis all markets, and we do need necessary tools to address unfair international competition. In practice, I would say de-risking means being aware of vulnerabilities and reducing excessive dependencies that may have implications for our economies and for our security. The Chinese intelligence law from 2017 should be taken at face value. Security in the Indo-Pacific and the transatlantic area is increasingly interconnected. We would welcome China playing a part in a solution to restore Ukraine's territorial integrity and ending Russia's illegal aggression. But we are not naive about the long-term partnership between China and Russia. Sometimes countries simply have to choose, and China should not support Russia's war. As for Taiwan, let me underline our concern regarding the escalation of the tensions in the Taiwan Strait. Any crisis as a result of an attempt to change the status quo in the Taiwan Strait using force would have very, very far-reaching consequences. The EU's One China policy remains unchanged, as you know, but we continue to be impressed by the democratic as well as economic development of Taiwan, and we remain keen to further develop our relations. This brings me to a conclusion regarding the EU's credibility as a global actor. Our relations with and exposure to China is a matter where the EU27 should unite. The EU's credibility and effectiveness rests on our ability to stand up for the agreed policy and live up to our own interests and values. That's very obvious for all countries, but increasingly so also for the bigger ones. Those now saying, why should we have to choose side between China and the US, are simply asking themselves the wrong question. As Europeans, we should formulate our own open but firm approach, but also rely on long and strong partnerships with the US and other democracies. Obviously, that also requires our own societies to remain successful, to remain attractive, to remain democratic role models for the rest of the world, because nothing could compare with that. Thank you so much.